My name is John-Manuel Andriote, and I was telling this young lady earlier that I started writing about HIV and AIDS in 1986 when I was in journalism school at Northwestern in Chicago. And friends of mine, my first two friends at that time died from AIDS. We were in our mid-20s at that point. And so it was shocking, it was affecting me personally, it was something all over the news at that point, and for a budding young journalist, it just had all the makings of something that I could really sink my teeth into, and dedicate my skills to documenting this horrific epidemic. So that's what I've done. I started writing about AIDS for local newspapers in Washington, where I moved in '86 and lived for 22 years. Excuse me. And in 1999, I finally published, after 5 years that I had been working on a book, Deferred, How AIDS Changed Gay Life in America. And for that book, I traveled around the United States, interviewed several hundred people, men and women who were spearheaded the efforts at the community level in cities around the country and smaller towns, people in government, people in biomedical research who were looking for treatments for HIV and researching vaccines, people in political Washington. So it's all sort of there in Victory Deferred. That's where it all sort of coalesced, all of my reporting. And I've continued to write about the epidemic since the book originally came out in 1999 from the University of Chicago Press. And then last year, 2011, I brought out a revised edition of the book, for which I got foundation grants to travel again, to interview a bunch more people, a lot of the same people I interviewed 15 years earlier. Many of the people I interviewed in the mid-90s were no longer alive. So the interviews I did with them then became kind of historically significant. And all those are actually collected at the Smithsonian, all of those interviews, the Victory Deferred collection. So I continue to report about AIDS, and what I'm going to talk to you tonight is kind of about looking at where we are now compared to where President Obama and Secretary Hillary Clinton initially announced a year ago an AIDS-free generation. This is our goal. Now, the president has said this is our nation's a global policy priority. Okay, that's very key. A global policy priority and something that the United States will put all of its weight behind. So it's a very noble statement, and a very powerful and appealing statement. But exactly just how close are we to achieving it? Where are we now, medically, scientifically, politically, financially, compared to where we need to be to really curb this epidemic? The United Nations AIDS program, just last week everybody involved in HIV and AIDS, were all issuing statements and so forth for World AIDS Day. So I was really able to get very current information, from the people that I interviewed, because I did this article, which I brought copies, actually will be published tomorrow in the Atlantic, and this is on this exact subject. How far are we from an AIDS-free generation? So I interviewed very amazing people, from Nancy Mahon, who is a lawyer. She is the Global Executive Director of the MAC Cosmetics AIDS Foundation, but most importantly, she is the chair of the President's Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. So she has some clout with Mr. Obama. She had very interesting things to say about where we are versus where we need to be. to achieve the AIDS-free generation. And that phrase, I expect you'll hear more about it, because it now has entered that special place where it's almost like a pop cultural mantra, AIDS-free generation. We just heard a lot about it in the past week. So the UNAIDS program says 34 million people in the world are living with HIV. Okay, we've made enormous progress in a very short time, actually, in getting antiretroviral therapy out to people who need it. Okay, most of those people are in the world's poorest countries in the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. Okay, and I think 18.5 million people, south of the Sahara in Africa are those 34 million. 18.5 million are in sub-Saharan Africa. But in the last decade, we have gone from 50,000 people worldwide on treatment for HIV to 8 million people. So it's a dramatic increase in the number of people who are getting the medications they need to stay alive. However, when you consider 34 million people, 8 million are getting treatment, in this country we recommend that people with HIV begin to take medication when their T cells, their white blood cells that HIV attacks, drop below 500. Okay, so by that measure, what is the standard in our country, there are many millions of those 34 million people who really need medication. So, and in fact, the top medical people in this country say that somebody should begin treatment pretty quickly after they are diagnosed. That's ideal, is as soon as you find out, you start taking medication, because it makes someone up to 96% less infectious. So it's the best prevention. Treatment is prevention. If you treat people who have the virus, it makes it very difficult, almost impossible, for them to transmit the virus. So that's the best thing to do, is to shut down the virus, the infectiousness of the virus. So 8 million of 34 million have medication. Last year was a banner year in that only, and let me see, I want to get this number right here. Only 2.5 million new HIV infections. This was down from 20% in 2001. And only 1.7 million people died from AIDS, which is entirely preventable. AIDS is, and as a writer, I'm very sort of specific about language, because HIV infection is manageable with medication. AIDS, which is end-stage HIV disease, when the immune system, has been just destroyed by the virus. AIDS refers to a very specific late stage of illness, where opportunistic infections and cancers and all these horrific things that we saw in the 80s before there was treatment. But those things are now virtually entirely preventable with medication. So another point that I made in doing my interviews is that when we talk about an AIDS-free generation, it's very different from talking about an HIV-free generation. HIV will be with us, for the foreseeable future. And in fact, I watched Secretary Clinton's comments for World AIDS Day when at the State Department they just rolled out the new blueprint for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, which is the U.S. government's global AIDS program that President George W. Bush created. And that is the largest single source of funding for HIV treatment and prevention globally. Okay, so they just rolled out a new blueprint, spelling out the goals and strategies for the U.S. government's program going forward. And Secretary Clinton was very clear. She said, make no mistake, HIV will be with us into the foreseeable future, but the disease it causes doesn't have to be. And that's a very important distinction, because we have now, with available medication, the capacity to end the AIDS epidemic. And that's pretty well agreed on by the United Nations, by our government. Dr. Robert Gallo, who I interviewed, who is a microbiologist, who proved that HIV was the cause of AIDS back in 1984 and developed the first blood test to screen the blood supply, saved millions of people's lives. Dr. Gallo, I asked him, what do you think it's going to take to end the AIDS epidemic? And of course, a vaccine is the holy grail, a vaccine that would prevent anyone from becoming infected. But then for people who are infected, the medications that we have now are, for all intents and purposes, what Dr. Gallo said is a functional cure. It's not a cure in terms of purging the virus from the body, but it's the best we can do right now. It suppresses the virus to an undetectable level, makes somebody, almost completely uninfectious. So yes, we hope to achieve what is called a sterilizing cure, where every last molecule of virus, could certifiably be eliminated from the body. But while we wait for science to do that, what we have now is pretty good compared to what we had 25 years ago, when people in the Western world were dying from the things that people in the developing world are still dying from. It's like diabetes. The analogy is so almost exact, where in this country, we look at diabetes almost as a lifestyle. It's sort of you inject yourself and then eat a bowl of ice cream, kind of thing. But I've known people in this country just in the last few years who have died from diabetes. And in the developing world, millions of people a year die from diabetes. It's a really horrible disease. It really affects your organs and just all kinds of things. So HIV at this point is comparable to that in the sense that for those who are able to access the medication, who benefit from the medication, you can really live with HIV and live a pretty normal life. But for those who don't have medication, it's just as grim and horrible and deadly as it was in the 80s. The way we saw it here in this country, the way I saw it in friends of mine. So we've made enormous progress. We have a long way to go in terms of the science, sort of finally delivering a cure for HIV, a real cure, and a vaccine that would prevent new infections. But for the time being, and this was the interesting thing to talk with these folks that I've just interviewed, what can we do in the time, for the time being? Without a vaccine, without a cure, how can we move toward the AIDS-free generation? And 201, whether it was Dr. Steve Morin, the director of the AIDS Research Center at the University of California, San Francisco, or the president's, chair of the President's Commission, or Dr. Gallo, or various other advocates that I interviewed in Washington, everyone says the same thing, that political will, having the leadership by the president who is willing to spend some political capital on this to insist that, you know, at a time of cutting budgets, that this is not the time to cut budgets for HIV prevention, that we're so close to, you know, being able to really curb this in a huge way, that we have the technology, we have the medication, but we need the political will, which is another way of saying we need the president to say, get it done. And then we need the funding support to back it, because, you know, it always takes resources. And so is Dr. Morin from UCSF, and that's what I always get confused with, UCFS. You know, he worked for Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi in Washington, which is kind of when I knew Steve Morin, back when we both lived in DC. And so he's been around Capitol Hill and, you know, is kind of seasoned veteran of the whole process. And he said, you know, we need to roll out the National HIV/AIDS strategy that the Obama administration debuted 2 years ago. But it's going to take a lot of money to implement that. You know, it's all very nice. This is what the best minds in our country have come up with and said, here's what we need to do to seriously get more people into prevention, get more people tested on treatment. You know, 20% of people with HIV in this country don't know that they're infected. I mean, think about the implications of that. You know, they don't know they're infected, they don't know that they're infecting somebody else. So we need to get on top of this so that even within our own country, the wealthiest country in the world, let alone, you know, in the bush in Africa, where AIDS is a huge problem, but right in our own country, 20% of people with HIV don't know their status. You know, that's pretty shocking. The CDC just released statistics last week that 26% of all new HIV infections in this country are among 13 to 24-year-olds. You know, something's falling down here in terms of educating younger people about the realities of HIV, even in a time of effective treatment. You know, that this is still not something they want to get. So it's an interesting time, and it's an exciting time, and everyone I know who's involved in, you know, HIV advocacy and politics and science, and they all say the same thing, that this is really an exciting time in the epidemic, that we really do have the opportunity to turn the corner in a big way, you know, and not entirely eliminate HIV, but get to a point, a tipping point, as they call it, where more people are on treatment than new infections each year, you know, so that you can finally get a handle on this. And Dr. Gallo said that epidemics, when people are treated, there's not the kind of kindling of the epidemic, you know, think of kindling a fire, where you've got millions of new infections a year, but only a fraction of people with HIV getting medication. Suddenly you've got vastly more people who need treatment than, you know, you're able to treat. So it's an exciting time, but we need our, as I like to say, we need our political leaders to put our money where their mouths are. Because an AIDS-free generation is very exciting, but without the resources needed to support the programs that we know work, to reach the people who are most at risk and, you know, living with HIV, until we put our money, you know, where our mouths are, then it's all just a lot of gas, really, a lot of rhetoric. So anyway, that's sort of in a nutshell what I was going to say. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any questions.
Tell us more about your book. It's all this document. You just documented your your visits with people and what they got to say?
Well, no, it reads like a story, except it's real life. People that I interviewed who founded community-based AIDS organizations, who set up programs to care for sick and dying people when mainstream organizations didn't want to touch them. So stories from people who fought with ambulance drivers to take someone to the hospital, who didn't want to take that person because they had AIDS, to people, who meet with the president, and everybody in between, really, sort of looking at, as the subtitle of the book, how AIDS changed gay life in America, how it built the gay civil rights movement. It really brought thousands of people, millions of people, into this movement for equality and justice, who weren't involved before AIDS. Families, co-workers, neighbors, and so on. So it really built up national LGBT organizations to the point that they actually have some political clout now in Washington. And it changed a lot of things at the National Institutes of Health, because AIDS activists, and every scientist will say this, in whatever their field, if it's cancer or whatever, they all say AIDS activists are the ones who really force change. They force the government to allow seriously ill people to access experimental treatment if there was no other treatment. That was a huge, radical step forward. It was a very conservative, actually, political argument to say, the government shouldn't tell us what we can put into our bodies. If we're willing to assume the risk, it's not the government's role to dictate that. And it was interesting because there was a time when the AIDS activists and the pharmaceutical company CEOs were really speaking the same language. Because of course the pharmaceutical companies want to sell their products, which is what they do, in a free enterprise system. And the AIDS activists are saying, hey, it's our choice, it shouldn't be the government's choice. And same, with women's choice. It's is it, whatever you think of abortion, whose choice is it? Does the government tell you, or is it up to individuals to decide? So it was the same exact argument. It's if I'm sick and dying and there's no treatment, and I'm willing to take this thing, it's my choice. So that was huge. That was big.
Who was going to pay for it?
Sorry?
But it was all about who was going to pay for that. I worked at a HMO, that was, and so that in the 80s, and we had plenty, with government contracts, there were plenty of young men that had AIDS, and it's the HMO after a while realized how much it was losing money on trying to treat, to do all these drugs and to do all that kind of stuff. So, and I imagine these young gentlemen didn't have the kind of dollars that it took to take all those drugs. So did they go on government?
Well, there weren't all those drugs back then.
Right, not as, right.
Yeah.
And then when they did, they had to take lots of drugs.
Well, in 1987, the first drug for HIV, AZT, was approved. And that's all there was. There were drugs for prophylaxis against pneumocystis pneumonia, like Bactrim and things like that. But for about 6 years, AZT was the only antiretroviral approved. So it wasn't until the early 90s, and then certainly in the mid-90s, after 1996, when we started using combination treatments. When you have 3 and 4 drugs being combined, and now we're at a point where some people newly diagnosed who have never taken medication before can take a daily pill, one a day. And that's just amazing. It's amazing. People used to have timers that went off, every few hours in the late 80s, all day and all night, wake them up so they could take their pills. people died from the drugs, you know. I laugh, it's not funny, but. Yes, sir.
What's your impression of the Obama support, the budgetary support for this?
Well, you know, they are shifting around a lot of money to make it look like there's some momentum, you know, to their words, but this professor from Johns Hopkins, David Holdgrave, who everybody is now quoting, you know, he did an estimate that it would require $15.2 billion a year to achieve the goals of the National HIV/AIDS Strategy, which the strategy was released in 2010 with the goals of, you know, ramping up prevention programs and access to testing and treatment by 2015. That would be a dramatic increase. But the funding, you know, they've actually cut the funding for HIV/AIDS. So that's what I'm saying, and that's what all these folks are saying. It's like an AIDS-free generation, great, it all sounds marvelous, you know. But when you're cutting the budget, rather than spending the real money that it takes to accomplish what you say you want to accomplish, excuse us if we have a wait-and-see, you know, kind of cynical attitude about it.
I was just watching the news a couple of days ago, and we're talking about, I believe it was Boehner, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
A couple of protesters went to his office
Got
naked.
Yeah.
And,
They what?
They got naked in Boehner's office.
Oh.
right, because of the budget cuts. So just to, you know, say that, and I actually invited my friend earlier today to this event, and she wanted to go to the mall instead, and I think she did, I'm not sure. But it's just maybe some advice on how to maybe make that connection, or, you know, start that conversation about, you know, why this is so important. And maybe we should have, you know, I don't know, priorities really, or in my view.
I mean, how do you start the conversation
Right, like how do I,
with a friend?
right, to like,
Oh.
you know, help them.
Well, here's a different answer than most people will give you, and it's sort of, I'll just show you something here. This was partly why I asked for this, and I'm doing this for a reason, as you'll see. This is a little different. This is a new ebook of mine that just came out last week, and it's a book that I wrote after I wrote Victory Deferred. It was originally called Hot Stuff, A Brief History of Disco, but I updated it, and it's now an ebook, and it's called Hot Stuff, A Brief History of Disco / dance music, because that's what disco is now. And the reason I bring this up is because, you know, reporters asked me when this book first came out, you know, gee, you write about AIDS and all these serious things, and then you write this book about disco, you know, like, it seems kind of like you're wasting your time or whatever. And what I have come to understand is that, you know, as I researched dance music from the 1970s, when the whole disco, you know, era happened, the reason the music became so popular, a reason, is because it was a very hard decade. There were all these terrible things that went on in the 70s, you know, the end of Vietnam and Watergate and stagflation and gas lines, and, you know, economically, it was a really scary time. And in scary and uncertain times, musicians, especially African-American musicians, speed up music. In the 20s, they speeded up jazz. You had faster dance styles. Jitterbug in the 30s. And so in the 70s, you had this happy music, you know, that people went to the discos to dance and to escape from kind of this very difficult time they were living in. And so I use that to make the point that this happy music, which I really like a lot of gay men like dance music, and I'm one of them. 98.3 is a great radio station. You know, this music reminds us that even when times are hard, there are, you know, you can still celebrate the good times of life. There are happy times to be having with your friends and, you know, just being alive and enjoying this music. And so, for me, that point segues naturally into making the point that life is worth celebrating and life is worth protecting and being here for the next dance, you know? And to me, that's sort of a natural opening gambit, you know, to talk about something that has nothing to do with dance music on the surface, but that if you sort of probe it a little bit, it's like, well, what is dance music? What do we listen to this for? You know, what's it about? It's about helping us to stay balanced and, you know, sort of not give into the gloomy dark side. And because we want to live in a, you know, happier, more positive place, there are things that we need to know about the scary things in life, like HIV and, you know, things like that, that you just need to, you know, this is what you need to know to protect yourself, so that you're here, you know, as my friends, like going forward, to dance many dances in the years ahead. So, I don't know, did you all follow me there? They're making that connection? To me it makes sense. But
In some ways, in other ways, no, because discos, they did lots of drugs. And that kind of led into
they still do lots of drugs.
They do lots of drugs that led into some of the problems with HIV and AIDS. But on the other hand, I think what I was reading a lot is one of the reasons there's less funding and things is because it's not in the news every day. The numbers aren't going up and rising. It's not like on the front pages of the paper.
Well, yeah.
So that the kids in school, I don't know what health teachers teach anymore. You know, our kids are older. Like, did they teach STIs? Did they teach HIV? Did they teach birth control?
They still are in the high school.
In high school, they are. So,
And in fact, she start the conversation in junior high.
oh, okay.
They do,
So
which is good. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
14 years
Oh, yeah.
old.
Oh, yeah.
And delicately, they kind of just touch on it, and then each year it gets a little bit more intense. And
Well,
they all
junior high,
have to-
they could probably be even a little less delicate.
Yeah.
But my guess is like her friend, it's more like, it's never gonna happen to me. It's, oh, that's a gay man's thing. I'm not gay. That's a drug user. I might not be an IV drug user. That again, it's not gonna happen to me or whatever. So what do I have to go and hear about it? You know, why do I need to listen? You know, what do we need to fund it again for? You know, I'm wondering, how are we doing in New London County?
Well, that's a good question. I know that in Connecticut, there are about 10,000 people living with HIV. I don't know in London County specifically, because I haven't looked at the statistics recently. Been focused on all this.
Yeah. But the
other stuff. And,
Lines for Living still continuing.
mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else?
I just want to ask you an unrelated question. I saw that you're selling that ebook for less than a cup of latte at Starbucks.
Oh,
Cute phrase. I don't know much about. Have you sold many things? Are these what people pay you $2.99 and they read it on Kindles? Is that what it is?
well, that's what it's for, yeah.
And have you sold many more that way than you would on a hard copy?
Well, I don't know. It just came out literally a couple of
Oh, I
days
see.
ago.
Okay. Well, good luck. I just have a.
Thank you. No,
No,
literally,
about
I think
ebooks.
like Thursday or Friday, it was up on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Well, how about this Victory Deferred? Is that available on ebook? It's kind of thick.
It is, yeah. Yeah, it's, the ebook is, I think, $4.99. Yeah,
And are there sales of that?
I think so. you know, I haven't made a king's
Eyeglasses
ransom,
to
but.
read all the pages.
I know. I'm just curious, could you talk a little bit, a few years ago, there was quite a lot of stuff in the news about senior citizens contacting AIDS. Is that still a problem, or do you know what I'm talking about? That was about 4 or 5 years ago. There was this big epidemic supposedly of senior citizens. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, nobody contracts AIDS. You can contract HIV, and then if you don't treat it, you can develop AIDS. That's a really key, you know, distinction. But no, actually, the people over 50 are the largest increasing group in the United States, you know, with HIV, because a lot of people with HIV are living longer, and so, you know, the older you live, the more opportunities there would be to maybe infect somebody else, you know, your own age or whatever, if you're not treated, if you don't know your status.
Just a side note on that, certainly senior citizens are a huge issue, especially in Florida. Our centers were in New Mexico, but also heterosexual women particularly, and minorities, often overlooked.
Well, another thing, I mean, in talking about young people and also not as young people, you know, the lines between straight and gay are very blurry. And with younger people, you know, there's a lot more sort of same-sex behavior, you know, than maybe there used to be, or I guess there always has been, but it's just maybe more open about it. And that's something to be aware of, you know, and something that I've said, like when I've spoken to college groups, is, you know, ladies, like, you should know that, you know, your boyfriend may not be only sleeping with you, you know, and don't make choices that put power in his hands, you know, not to use protection or something, like, if you don't know this person very well, or know their status.
Recently, yeah, I feel like I've been hearing a lot more about HIV and AIDS awareness. So on MSN, we see like maybe actually this Sunday or Saturday, the Young Turks, the protesters, HBO had a documentary about, maybe this man's name was, started with a V. Sorry, I forgot his name. So I was wondering, you know, why is that? You know, is it just because it's the build up from the advocacy itself, or is there a person or a group or an event that kind of kickstarted this kind of like new wave, if you will?
The new wave of coverage of it?
Right.
Well, Saturday was World AIDS Day,
Oh, okay.
so that there was a lot of media coverage. Yeah, every year that happens, and then it'll sort of fade away, you know. That is, you know, that goes to something you said. You don't see it in the news every day, and so it's very easy to assume that the problem's been taken care of, you know, that once a year at World AIDS Day, suddenly you hear these numbers and you're like, whoa, 34 million people, you know, out of 7 billion human beings, that's not a lot, but when you consider that 3/4 of those people aren't being treated and are capable of infecting others, you know, that's, it puts it into proportion. It's not like 34 million people who have cancer, you know, where if they die, that's kind of like, it ends there. It's kind of like as long as somebody is alive, you know, with the virus, they could transmit it to someone else.
In your research, particularly recently, have you noticed any changes, flexible changes with regard to religious groups, Catholics, Muslims, Jews, and all?
Well, the interesting thing, like in July when I was in Washington at the International AIDS Conference, is when you go to workshops and, you know, presentations given by younger people from wherever, you know, the former countries of the former Soviet Union or Africa, you know, Egypt. I mean, there were these young women I mean, first of all, they're like these amazing young people, you know, who are incredibly informed and passionate and active, but they sort of much more easily blend together. You know, like one is wearing a headscarf and you know, from Nigeria, and another is wearing like, you know, a chador or something. And they don't think twice about it. You know, they sort of work together across their religious and national identities on something that they all care about. But, you know, the older people are much more sort of set in their ways, you know, and their ways of thinking. And so there hasn't been a whole lot of progress, you know, from the Vatican, for example, since the start of the AIDS epidemic 31 years ago. I mean, one big change was American evangelicals, you know, who've gotten more involved since George W. Bush became president, when funding was made available for faith-based organizations. You know, the downside of their involvement was that they didn't have so much experience in development, like working in developing countries, whereas the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church had lots of experience. They had lots of clinics and hospitals, and those faith-based programs are something that the U.S. government's PEPFAR program, you know, the Global AIDS Program, has really focused on, is kind of strengthening those hospitals and labs and clinics because they have access to the communities, you know, whereas the American evangelical groups had no real ties in the community, and so they got all this money to do this work, but they didn't have the experience that the, you know, nuns and people who had been doing it for the Catholic and Anglican Church already had that credibility in the community.
So what do you think we can do now, grassroots level, moving forward? Like, what are the groups, like all the different LGBT groups, like what are they focusing on, testing?
The which groups?
Different, like LGBT groups around, like, you know, what can, like on testing to find new cases, or what, you know, what can be done now?
Well, the LGBT groups, unfortunately, have largely been focused on marriage equality.
Oh, true.
And so, you know, I've been kind of busting their chops in the way I do sometimes, in articles, you know, in gay and lesbian publications like the Gay and Lesbian Review, where, you know, I said that saving people's lives is a bigger priority than the right to marriage. That not everyone who is, you know, gay or lesbian would list marriage equality as their top priority, especially if they're trying to figure out how they're going to pay for HIV medications and, you know, sort of struggling along like so many Americans. So there's been a real disconnect between the, you know, kind of white, upper middle class LGBT groups in Washington and the grassroots kind of people, you know, out there who are dealing with either having HIV or being at risk for HIV, and the LGBT groups haven't taken leadership roles for many years. And I've been very critical of them. And actually Larry Kramer, you know, I did a piece that came out in September, October for the Gay and Lesbian Review called Reclaiming HIV as a Gay Disease. You know, it's obviously not a gay disease. It doesn't only affect gay men. But gay men in this country have overwhelmingly borne the brunt of HIV. And so the analogy that I always use, and that my Jewish friends use, is that in the Holocaust, you know, Jews weren't the only ones persecuted and killed by the Nazis, but they have been the loudest in preserving the memory of their unique, horrible experience. And that's my view of how, gay America needs to deal with HIV/AIDS, is that it's not just a gay disease, but it has overwhelmingly affected gay men. Of those 26% of new HIV infections that affect young people, 13 to 24, 78% of them are males, from having sex with other males. So 78%, that's a big percentage. And to have the national LGBT groups not speaking out about this, I think is really just a disgrace. And I've said that to, LGBT groups.
And what is their reaction?
Well, individually people seem to agree, but that doesn't really affect the policy of those organizations. They are pretty much looking out for the interests of other white, middle-class, gay people.
Speaking of overwhelmingly, particularly like black males over the age of 25,
Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't know the number specifically, but maybe like 2/3 or over like 50% will be affected with HIV.
Yeah, it's shocking. It's shocking. In 21 U.S. cities, the Centers for Disease Control found that as many as 50% of black men who have sex with men, gay and bisexual men, up to 50% of them have HIV. That is shocking. That's higher than anywhere in the world, in the hardest hit countries. And it's right here in our country, So until our political leaders decide that this is not acceptable, that we can't be preaching to the world about an AIDS-free generation when 1 in 5 of our own people who have HIV don't know it, and aren't accessing medication. It's like we really need to start at home here and getting our own situation under control. But the same thing, it's going to take political will, which means money, and it means the president being willing to talk about it. Keep it in front of the public's eye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Well,
Robert.
thank you. Thank you very much for coming.